Imagine your biggest rival isn't, just building an army on your border. Imagine they're actively paying your neighbors to build these high-tech security cameras pointing directly at your neck.
Right. It's a terrifying thought.
Yeah, and for decades, India has basically operated under this assumption of a comfortable sphere of influence in its immediate neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
A geopolitical buffer zone.
Yeah.
But if you look at the map right now, that zone is being bought up, paved over, and essentially weaponized against New Delhi.
It is contracting at an alarming rate, honestly. We're looking at a geopolitical landscape that is undergoing this intense, rapid recalibration. The old playbooks, they simply do not work anymore.
Which is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We're opening up a high-stakes strategic briefing for you to analyze how India's traditional neighborhood-first policy is buckling.
And it really is buckling under the weight of China's massive infrastructure diplomacy, plus, internal friction from India's own domestic politics.
Exactly, and a highly weaponized brand of local nationalism. Look, this isn't abstract political theory. This is a real-world, highly classified style look at how a rising superpower tries to balance diplomacy, hard power, and economic leverage to prevent a hostile strategic encirclement.
Right. And to understand the mechanics of this encirclement, you have to look at where the noose is tightening first. If you want to see the real vulnerabilities, you don't start at the heavily fortified, snow-capped borders.
Where do you start?
You start on the eastern flank. Specifically, you look at a massive strategic threat currently hiding in plain sight, completely disguised as a civilian water management project.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of this. We're talking about Bangladesh and this very sudden pivot toward Beijing. The core of this issue revolves around the Teesta River.
Yes, the Teesta.
For 15 years, India and Bangladesh have been locked in this deadlock dispute over sharing the waters of the Teesta. And the reason for the deadlock, it's entirely domestic.
Precisely.
Mhm.
Because under the Indian constitution, water is largely a state subject. So the federal government in New Delhi, they can't simply sign an international water treaty without the consent of the border state involved. In this case, West Bengal has effectively vetoed the treaty for a decade and a half over local political concerns.
So just because New Delhi couldn't get its own internal politics aligned to deliver on a promise, Bangladesh simply lost patience. And what happens when a state loses patience? They look for another patron.
Exactly. Dhaka has now formally invited China to execute what they call the TRCMP.
The Teesta River Comprehensive Management Project.
Right. And the implications of this are staggering when you look at the physical geography. I mean, you might be wondering, why does a dam matter?
Because it's not just a dam. It's about where it's located. Think about the Siliguri corridor, right? Often called the chicken's neck.
Which is highly vulnerable.
Very. It is a vital, incredibly narrow strip of land, in some places only about 22 kilometers wide. If you drive down that corridor for an hour, you've essentially crossed from Nepal through India and into Bangladesh.
It connects the main body of India to its entire northeastern region.
Right. So by inviting China to execute this massive civil engineering project on the Teesta, Bangladesh is letting Chinese state-backed engineers, heavy machinery, and inevitably surveillance capabilities just park right next to that highway.
It's establishing a permanent footprint just kilometers away from India's most critical geographic choke point. But, the encirclement doesn't stop at the riverbanks.
No, it doesn't.
If you expand the map just slightly south to the Bay of Bengal, the squeeze gets even tighter.
Right, because the maritime domain is shifting too.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at Mangalaport.
Yeah, so Bangladesh recently signed a major agreement with a Chinese state-owned company to develop a massive economic zone right near Mangalaport.
And the crazy part is,
What's crucial for our briefing here is that this Chinese project is actively replacing a previously planned economic zone that was supposed to be backed by India.
wait, so Dhaka literally swapped out New Delhi for Beijing on a major maritime asset.
They did, just swapped them out. And if you pull back and look at the whole board, you see this forms a deliberate tightening maritime triangle.
Okay, map it out for us.
Look at the apex of the Bay of Bengal. You now have Mangalaport in Bangladesh. Swing your eyes west to the Arabian Sea. You have Wadar Port in Pakistan, which is heavily controlled by China.
Right.
Swing south, you have Hambantota in Sri Lanka, at least to China. It is a calculated maritime squeeze designed to hem in Indian naval operations and economic projection.
I mean, on paper, it looks like pure outward aggression. But if you look closer, This entire encirclement strategy seems born out of something else. Like, why is Beijing spending billions to hem India in?
That's the real question.
To understand their motives, we have to look at the boundaries China absolutely refuses to let anyone cross.
Exactly. You really have to map Beijing's paranoia. In this current era of intense US-China competition, Beijing has explicitly laid out what they call their 4 red lines.
Okay, these aren't just suggestions.
No, these are not diplomatic talking points. These are the non-negotiable triggers for major escalation.
So what are the actual red lines? Walk us through them.
First, Taiwan, which Beijing calls the core of core interests.
Okay.
Second is territorial integrity, specifically focusing on Tibet and Xinjiang. Third is absolute political sovereignty over Hong Kong.
And a fourth.
And fourth is the preservation of their developmental and political system, meaning absolutely no foreign challenge to the Chinese Communist Party's rule and massive pushback against Western tech denial or economic sanctions.
Wait, hold on a second. Let's look at the actual nature of these red lines. Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the survival of the CCP. Out of those 4, 3 are explicitly about internal stability.
Yes, they are.
They are about suppressing domestic dissent and maintaining territorial control within their own claimed borders. So isn't Chinese foreign policy actually driven by a profound sense of regime insecurity?
That is the exact analytical lens you need to apply here.
It sounds less like the confidence of a rising superpower and more like they are terrified of their own fragility.
I completely agree. China's aggressive global posture is, in many ways, a heavily armed shield for its internal vulnerabilities. And, this ties directly back to India.
Because of Tibet.
Exactly. Because Tibet is a non-negotiable red line for China, the entire Himalayan border with India is electrified. Add in the impending, highly sensitive issue of the Dalai Lama's eventual succession, and you realize that Beijing views the Indian border not just as a territorial dispute.
It's an existential threat.
Right. It's an active vulnerability for CCP regime survival. They simply cannot afford to look weak on the Tibetan frontier.
Which means this high-altitude friction isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But it's not just Chinese troops causing friction in the Himalayas, is it? Because Tibet is such a massive vulnerability, the entire region is destabilized.
Yeah, the ripple effects are huge.
Which brings us to Nepal and the resurgence of the Lipulekh, Kalapani, and Limpiatura border dispute.
Right, so we have this highly sensitive tri-junction area where India, Nepal, and China meet. And suddenly, Kathmandu is aggressively reviving claims over it, even publishing new official maps that include Indian-controlled territory.
And as analysts, we have to ask why now? What changed in Nepal's domestic scene to trigger this? I mean, it's not like the mountains literally moved.
No, what moved was the political math in Kathmandu.
Yeah.
This is heavily driven by domestic electoral demographics.
How so?
Well, over the last few years, shifting political coalitions in Nepal have realized that anti-India maximalism is a guaranteed vote winner.
Ah, so it's a distraction tactic.
Very much so. Nepalese politicians are using aggressive rhetoric against New Delhi to basically mask their own governance failures and consolidate power at home.
But the reality for India is that this isn't just some local election stunt. It's a hard military necessity. Let's talk about Galwan.
Right, 2020.
Back in 2020, Indian and Chinese forces engaged in lethal hand-to-hand combat in the Galwan Valley. That permanently altered India's military posture. Post-Galwan, control of the Kalapani territory, and specifically the Lipulekh Pass, which is a very high-altitude vantage point, is non-negotiable for New Delhi.
It is absolute bedrock for Indian troop movement, for maintaining logistics lines, and, crucially, for surveillance against Chinese artillery positions.
So India's stance is essentially, we've had a military presence here for decades. This is a core security requirement against China, and we will not internationalize this dispute with Nepal. They are refusing to let the UN or third parties get involved, right?
Because the moment a bilateral border dispute becomes an internationalized issue, China gets a diplomatic vector to intervene in a space where they already pose an active military threat.
Right.
New Delhi cannot allow Beijing to mediate in its own backyard.
Exactly. So if the Himalayas are locked in this tense military stalemate, India absolutely has to secure its eastern landmass. You cannot have vulnerabilities on a two-front border while also dealing with an unsecured rear flank.
You really can't.
And that strategic necessity leads us directly into a brutal diplomatic dilemma. Let's look at Myanmar and the confirmed 2026 visit of Myanmar's president to New Delhi.
Okay, so Myanmar is the strategic hinge of the entire region. It is India's only land bridge to the ASEAN nations.
Which is huge for trade.
It's the absolute cornerstone of New Delhi's Act East policy, which is designed to integrate the Indian economy with Southeast Asia.
Okay, I hear that, but let's look at the reality on the ground. Myanmar is currently run by a military junta that violently overthrew a democratic government. They are facing severe, bloody internal resistance.
That is the reality, yes.
So I have to push back hard on this strategy. By rolling out the red carpet for Myanmar's military leadership in 2026, isn't India destroying its global democratic credentials?
Well,
We are the world's largest democracy. Handshake photo ops with the junta actively bombing its own citizens. That actively hurts our diplomatic leverage in Washington and Europe. I mean, we are validating a dictatorship.
I hear the public relations argument, I really do. But diplomatic leverage in Washington doesn't secure the physical borders in Manipur or Mizoram.
But at what moral cost?
Ethics don't secure borders. That is the harsh, freezing reality of realpolitik. If New Delhi takes a moral high ground and refuses to engage the military leadership in Naypyidaw, who immediately steps into that void,
Yeah.
China takes complete, unquestioned economic and military dominance in Myanmar. And further, without the active cooperation of Myanmar's military, India simply cannot secure its own highly vulnerable, insurgency-prone northeast.
Right, because of the militant groups.
Exactly. You have militant groups that historically cross that porous 1,600-kilometer border. You need the Myanmar military to help police it.
And I suppose there's also the massive infrastructure play to consider. The Caledon Multimodal Transport Project.
Right, let's explain the logistics of Caledon because it perfectly highlights why India is trapped here. The goal is to connect the port of Kolkata to a seaport in Myanmar, navigate up a river, and then build a highway straight into India's landlocked northeast.
And why do all that?
To completely bypass that 22-kilometer Siliguri corridor we talked about earlier, it is a strategic lifeline.
Okay, I see the logic. But building a port and a highway in a foreign country that is actively controlled by a military junta, you cannot complete that project, let alone secure it, without dealing with the people holding the guns.
Hard security imperatives have absolutely forced India's hand.
So New Delhi is choosing cold pragmatism in the East. They will do whatever it takes to secure that flank. But what's fascinating to me is that if they are playing defense in Myanmar and Bangladesh, they are writing a totally new, highly aggressive playbook in the West against Pakistan.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're using an entirely different kind of weapon to do it.
They're weaponizing global finance.
Yes. We need to analyze the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. India has aggressively leveraged its new position as vice president of the FATF to choke Pakistan's terror ecosystem.
And the trigger for this renewed offensive was the recent Pahalgam terror attack. In the aftermath, New Delhi didn't launch airstrikes or rattle sabers.
What do they do?
They went to the FATF with a highly sophisticated intelligence dossier. We're talking fresh, irrefutable evidence of a state terror nexus, including verified videos of active-duty Pakistani military officials attending the public funerals of known militants.
Wow, so they took this evidence straight to the global financial watchdogs to push Pakistan back onto the gray list.
Now,
Let's unpack what the gray list actually does for you, because it's not just a strongly worded letter.
Not at all.
It essentially destroys a country's sovereign credit score.
Right.
When you are on that list, global banks refuse to lend to you without extortionate interest rates. It violently spikes borrowing costs, starves the central bank of foreign dollars, and scares off foreign direct investment. I mean, it's economic asphyxiation.
It forces Islamabad to make a choice between basic economic survival and funding militancy.
But here's where I see a massive strategic risk, and we need to debate this.
Okay, let's hear it.
The FATF is not the UN Security Council. It is a multilateral institution designed to track money laundering by cartels and rogue actors.
Wow.
We're using our vice presidency in a regulatory body to settle a bilateral security dispute.
I see where you're going with this.
Isn't India setting a highly dangerous precedent by politicizing the FATF? If we normalize breaking the multilateral tool to weaponize global financial governance against our rivals, what happens when China eventually takes the chair? They could weaponize the exact same institution against Indian state-backed projects.
Look, it is a totally valid concern about precedent, I grant you that. But consider the alternatives on the table.
Which are?
Financial warfare is the only bloodless mechanism left to deter state-sponsored terrorism. Traditional military strikes risk a nuclear escalation spiral. Diplomatic protests are completely ignored.
True.
The FATF mechanism effectively cripples the terror funding ecosystem without firing a single bullet across the line of control. Yes, it risks politicizing the institution, but in modern statecraft, financial leverage is the most ruthless and effective weapon available.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've mapped the entire board here. We've gone from the mechanical failure of the Teesta River Treaty to the Himalayan altitudes of Nepal, down through the junta in Myanmar, and over to global financial warfare against Pakistan.
It's a lot of ground.
It is. So when you look at this macro picture, what is the ultimate strategic implication for India's trajectory as a potential superpower? Is the neighborhood first policy fundamentally failing?
I wouldn't classify it as a failure, no.
Right.
But it is undergoing a forced, incredibly painful evolution. The policy is shifting from an assumption of historical, cultural goodwill to pure, cold transactional diplomacy.
Because you can't fight a checkbook with shared history.
Exactly. The core friction point we keep seeing across this entire briefing, whether it's in Bangladesh with the Teesta River and Mongla Port, or in Nepal with the border maps, is that India is trying to fend off a superpower rival that has essentially unlimited infrastructure capital.
Right.
But India's own grand strategy is frequently paralyzed by its own internal democratic friction.
And that is the ultimate glaring irony of this entire deep dive. India wants to project power. But a state government in West Bengal stalls a water treaty for local political points. And as a direct result, Chinese state engineers are suddenly building dams near the Chicken's Neck.
Right.
Nepalese politicians need a poll boost for a local election, so they challenge Indian military logistics in the Himalayas. To be a superpower, India cannot afford to let local state-level politics dictate its international security posture. The strategic space won't wait for domestic consensus to catch up.
And that is the true underlying crisis of the neighborhood first policy.
All right, we're in the final minutes of this strategic briefing. To ensure this intelligence actually sticks with you, we are going into rapid revision. Let's just re-rack the board for a second to lock in the strategic map.
Let's do it.
I'm going to call out the core memory anchors, and we need punchy, definitive definitions. Here we go. TRCMP.
Teesta River Comprehensive Management Project. The Chinese infrastructure threat looming alarmingly close to India's Siliguri corridor.
Mongla Port.
Bangladesh's seaport. Actively replacing Indian economic zones to become the newest node in China's Bay of Bengal maritime encirclement.
China's 4 red lines.
Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and CCP regime security. Cross them, and it means war. It proves their posture is driven by internal paranoia.
Caledon Multimodal Project.
The vital infrastructure lifeline through Myanmar. Designed to bypass the Chicken's Neck and connect the Indian mainland to the northeast, requiring cooperation with the military junta.
Lopulek Trijunction.
The highly disputed Himalayan pass with Nepal. An absolute non-negotiable military necessity for Indian logistics and surveillance against China post-Galwan.
FATF Gray List.
India's financial weapon of choice. Destroying a nation's sovereign credit score to economically suffocate terror networks without firing a single shot.
Perfect. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought.
Yeah.
Look at the entire geopolitical board we just mapped out today. China's absolute red lines and their massive outward expansion are fundamentally driven by their own internal regime insecurities and terrors.
Right.
Meanwhile, India's regional influence, its ability to actually project power, is actively being kneecapped by its own domestic state-level politics. The ultimate geopolitical battle of the 21st century isn't just about who has the better military on the border. It's about which superpower can keep its own internal house in order long enough to project real power outward. Think about that. Thank you for joining us on the Strategic Briefing. Stay curious, stay informed.
India's greatest geopolitical asset right now it's not a fleet of main battle tanks parked on a Himalayan border.
No, definitely not.
Right. And it isn't a nuclear submarine quietly patrolling the depths of the ocean either. If you actually look at the highest level strategic documents driving New Delhi's foreign policy today, you realize that India's ultimate weapon might actually be a digital payment app installed on a smartphone in the Seychelles.
Yeah, or a massive, reinforced underground rock cavern in the United Arab Emirates.
Exactly. So, welcome to the briefing room. Today's deep dive is a comprehensive, highly classified style strategic briefing. Our mission for you today is decoding India's aggressive geopolitical pivot across the Indo-Pacific.
It's fantastic to be here. And, your opening contrast between tanks and payment apps, it gets right to the heart of the matter for this briefing.
It really does. Because we are unpacking the exact mechanisms of how a nation transitions its entire geopolitical posture, going from a historically defensive crouch into, well, actively shaping the global balance of power.
Right. And if you study India's strategic geography historically, the obsession has always been continental. I mean, it's been completely dominated by its volatile land borders.
Himalayas, the line of control.
Exactly.
Oh.
But the authoritative texts and the policy maneuvers we are analyzing today, they reveal a profound paradigm shift. For India, national security of the 21st century is no longer just about manning the mountains in the freezing cold. It is fundamentally about maritime survival.
The theater has
The
expanded.
theater has absolutely expanded. It's not just land anymore.
Yeah, the focus is shifting to the water, and specifically to the supply chains that cross that water. So today, we're going to break down how India is rapidly forging structural, deeply embedded military and energy alliances. And they're doing this through two major doctrines.
The Link West policy and the Act East policy.
Right. And more importantly, we need to explore what this actually means for India's trajectory as a rising superpower. Because look, at the end of the day, no matter how large your population is or how fast your tech sector is growing, a superpower cannot fight, and it cannot grow without energy.
No, it can't. That is the hard, unyielding truth of macroeconomics and geopolitics. Energy is the oxygen of a modern economy, and it's the lifeblood of a modern military.
Without a completely secure flow of energy, all your other strategic ambitions are essentially paused.
Dead in the water.
Which brings us to our first major theater of operations for this briefing, the Western flank. The strategic documents we're looking at highlight a glaring, almost existential vulnerability for India.
The import dependency.
Yeah, the country imports somewhere between 88 to 90% of its crude oil. 90%.
It's a staggering number when you think about it.
It really is. That means any disruption in the Middle East, a war, a blockade, a massive terrorist attack, and the Indian economy immediately starts choking. So to shield itself, India has completely transformed its relationship with the UAE.
We're seeing a major shift away from a simple transactional buyer-seller dynamic.
Right, where India just, writes a check and waits for an oil tanker.
Exactly. They are moving toward the construction of a massive, deeply integrated energy security architecture.
And the physical foundation of that architecture is the development of strategic petroleum reserves, or SPRs.
Yeah. To mitigate the risk of supply shocks, India is currently parking roughly 30 million barrels of crude oil in massive underground rock caverns.
Just massive subterranean bunkers.
Right. And these are located domestically in places like Visakhapatnam and on the East Coast, and Chennikal. These are heavily fortified facilities designed to hold massive emergency stockpiles.
But here's the real masterstroke, right? The piece that is fundamentally reshaping the geopolitical chessboard in the Middle East. It's the reciprocal storage arrangement at the Fujairah oil terminal in the UAE.
Yes, Fujairah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I have to push back here. This is where the strategy seems incredibly bold, but also, slightly risky.
How so?
Well, it's one thing to build bunkers in Visakhapatnam, right inside your own borders, but storing your emergency reserves in Fujairah is like keeping your emergency fund in a completely different bank that operates on a different power grid. And in a notoriously unstable neighborhood, no less.
That's a finality.
In strategic circles, analysts are actually referring to these underground oil caverns as weapons of war. But are we really calling underground oil caverns weapons of war? Let's game this out. If a regional blockade happens and the Strait of Hormuz is completely shut down, does having millions of barrels of oil sitting in Fujairah actually save India? Or does it just delay the inevitable economic collapse?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this is exactly the debate happening in defense circles right now. To understand why Fujairah is an active deterrent and not just a glorified storage tank, you have to look at the specific geography.
Okay.
The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most critical oil choke point. It connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, but at its narrowest point, it is only 21 miles wide.
That's nothing.
It's tiny.
Yeah.
It is incredibly easy for a hostile actor to mine that strait or block it with anti-ship missiles. If a regional war erupts, ships cannot get in or out of the Persian Gulf safely. But Fujairah is uniquely positioned outside the Strait of Hormuz.
Wait, really? It's outside the choke pit?
Exactly. It sits right on the Gulf of Oman, facing the open waters of the Arabian Sea.
So even if the front door to the Middle East is heavily barricaded by a conflict, India has essentially financed and secured a private back door to its own oil.
Precisely. If the choke point closes, India's access to those specific reserves at Fujairah remains completely uninterrupted. The oil can be loaded onto tankers without ever going near the Strait of Hormuz.
But let me challenge the logistics of that, because yes, the oil makes it onto the tanker. But how does that tanker actually get to Mumbai if there's an active war going on in the region?
Right, and that is where naval power projection comes in. A narrow strait like Hormuz is a death trap for shipping because you can't maneuver.
You're a sitting duck.
Exactly. But the Arabian Sea is vast, open ocean. If the oil is loaded at Fujairah, the Indian Navy has the open water space to provide heavily armed escorts for those tankers all the way across the Arabian Sea to the Indian coast.
Oh, I see. You can protect a convoy in the open ocean. You cannot protect it in a 21-mile-wide strait.
Exactly. This is textbook strategic depth. And it ties directly into India's broader geoeconomic strategy to bypass volatile choke points entirely.
And we're talking about IM here.
Yes, most notably through IM.
The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. This was a huge talking point in the documents for this briefing.
Yeah, IM is a massive multimodal transit network designed to completely bypass the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
Because the Red Sea is heavily congested and vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. The mechanism is fascinating. Cargo ships leave India, dock in the UAE, and offload their containers onto a massive railway network.
Wow.
That rail network carries the goods straight across the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Jordan, right to the Mediterranean coast of Israel, where it is loaded back onto ships bound for Europe.
So it's basically a physical bypass surgery for global trade. If the Red Sea becomes impassable, say, due to intense missile attacks from the coast of Yemen, which we've seen, the economic blood still flows.
Exactly. By partnering so deeply with the UAE on both the Fujairah oil terminal and the IMS rail linkages, India is ensuring that no single geopolitical crisis can hold its economy hostage.
Okay, that makes sense. But having 30 million barrels of oil sitting safely in a cavern in the UAE or cargo waiting at a port is completely useless if the ships carrying it to and from Mumbai get intercepted on the open water.
That's the other half of the equation.
Right, which means the physical transit routes, the actual water, have to be secured. And that takes us directly to the maritime choke points, and specifically the role of the Seychelles.
The race for the Western Indian Ocean.
Let's get into it.
If you look at a map, the geography of the Seychelles is a strategic imperative that New Delhi simply cannot ignore. It is an archipelago that sits right atop the critical sea lines of communication, or SLOCs.
Which are basically the global shipping highways.
Exactly. The primary maritime highways linking the eastern coast of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. If you want true maritime domain awareness, meaning you know exactly who is sailing where, what they're carrying, and what their intentions are in the Western Indian Ocean, you absolutely must have a presence in the Seychelles.
And the strategy documents show India locking that presence down through two major maritime doctrines. We're looking at SAGAR, which stands for Security and Growth for All in the region, and Mahasagar, which literally translates from Hindi as vast ocean.
Right, which represents a broader framework for maritime cooperation.
Yeah, and we see these doctrines in action. I mean, the Indian Navy is handing over advanced patrol vessels to the Seychelles, integrating complex coastal radar systems, setting up joint surveillance operations.
Classic defense diplomacy.
But in reading through the source material, one detail completely threw me.
Yeah.
Alongside the patrol boats and the radar systems, India is actively rolling out UPI, its domestic digital payment system, in the Seychelles.
Yes, the UPI integration.
I need you to explain this to me. Wait, how is a digital payment app a maritime security tool? Our entire economic survival depends on narrow waterways like Hormuz and Malacca, and we are sending an app.
I know, it sounds entirely counterintuitive. We're used to measuring security in terms of steel and gunpowder.
Ships and missiles.
Exactly. But think about the nature of influence and leverage in the modern era. Handing over a patrol vessel is a physical, highly visible security guarantee, but it's transactional.
Okay.
Integrating a sovereign nation's financial infrastructure with your own through a system like UPI, that is entirely different.
Because it creates a dependency.
It builds deep, structural, everyday reliance. UPI allows for instant, zero-fee digital transfers. If the Seychelles adopts this, their daily economic life, from, buying a coffee to transferring business funds, runs on a tech stack fundamentally tied to New Delhi.
Oh, wow. So they are financially tethered.
Right. It positions India not just as a military partner who drops by for joint exercises, but as the indispensable embedded net security provider across all domains, physical and digital.
Okay, I understand the logic of structural reliance, but I have to play devil's advocate here on the analysts' debate.
Let's hear it.
Are we actually moving fast enough to secure these choke points with this soft power approach? We are sending payment apps and building digital bridges while China is physically expanding its naval footprint along the East African coast.
They're definitely expanding.
Beijing is building deep water ports in places like Djibouti, or is China's naval expansion already boxing us in? Can an area denial strategy built on digital partnerships and radar stations really stop a rapidly expanding Chinese Navy that is building physical, heavily militarized outposts?
Look, that is the defining strategic debate of the decade for the Indian Ocean. China is absolutely seeking dual-use port access and surveillance nodes along the African coastline. And they use massive infrastructure loans to build these ports.
The debt trap diplomacy.
Exactly. But India's calculus is that physical ports can become political liabilities. They generate debt resentment. By deepening ties with the Seychelles militarily, digitally, and economically without trapping them in debt, India makes itself the partner of choice.
So it's a softer, stickier kind of power.
Right. The ultimate goal isn't to build a wall of ships. It is to actively deny hostile navies uncontested operational space in India's backyard. If the Seychelles is fully integrated with India, they are highly unlikely to allow a Chinese nuclear submarine to dock and resupply at their ports. It's area denial through structural integration rather than blunt coercion.
Which means India is actively and creatively defending its Western supply lines. But in grand strategy, defense only gets you so far.
Eventually, you have to go on the offensive.
Exactly. You have to go on the strategic offensive. And that takes us to the eastern flank. The theater of operations essentially merges here, flowing from the Indian Ocean right into the highly contested waters of the Western Pacific. This is the Act East offensive.
And this is where the geopolitical balancing act becomes an incredibly high-stakes tightrope walk. To counterbalance its primary adversary, China-India recognizes it has to project power eastward. And the absolute core of this offensive posture is Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Yes. Over the last few years, Vietnam has emerged as India's most trusted, capable strategic partner in the South China Sea.
And reading the documents, this relationship has evolved way beyond just, friendly diplomatic handshakes or joint statements at summits. We are looking at the formation of a formidable defense and technology alliance.
It's very aggressive.
Yeah. We already saw the landmark sale of India's BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles to the Philippines a while back. Now, Vietnam is positioned as a major recipient of Indian defense technology.
But it's not just weapons. They are actively collaborating on securing semiconductor supply chains and, critically, processing rare earth minerals to break China's global monopoly.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that, because rare earths are huge. How exactly do India and Vietnam break a monopoly that Beijing has spent decades building?
It comes down to combining resources. Processing rare earths, which, are the essential raw materials for everything from smartphones to fighter jet targeting systems, requires massive technological capability and poses huge environmental challenges.
It's a dirty process.
Extremely dirty. For a long time, the world just let China handle it because it was cheap and they didn't mind the environmental cost.
Yeah.
But Vietnam actually sits on some of the largest unexploited rare earth reserves in the world.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they have massive reserves. What they have lacked is the capital and the advanced processing technology to refine them at scale. India is stepping in to provide that capital and technical expertise. Breaking that supply chain monopoly isn't just about making cheaper electronics. It is a shared, absolute survival imperative for both New Delhi and Hanoi to ensure their defense industries aren't reliant on a geopolitical rival.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's debate the historical precedent here, because this is a massive shift.
It's huge.
For decades, since its independence, India has prided itself on a very cautious, non-aligned posture. The doctrine was basically, we don't join military blocs and we don't poke the bear unnecessarily.
The classic non-aligned movement.
Right. But by actively transferring offensive capabilities like supersonic anti-ship missiles to Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations, is India completely abandoning its historically cautious, non-aligned posture by actively arming China's adversaries?
It's a valid question.
I mean, let's be clear about the geography for a second. India and China share a highly volatile 2,100-mile disputed border in the Himalayas, the line of actual control, or the LAC.
And it is heavily militarized.
We've seen brutal, fatal skirmishes there in recent years. So by arming Vietnam and the South China Sea, are we essentially opening a second front just to force China to back off our Himalayan borders at the LAC?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is undeniably a paradigm shift. The old version of non-alignment is dead.
It has to be.
But I wouldn't call this an abandonment of autonomy. I would call it an evolution into active deterrence. The strategic concept here is horizontal escalation.
Horizontal escalation. Explain that.
If a hostile power is aggressively pressuring India at the LAC in the Himalayas, India's response is no longer limited to just sending more troops into the freezing mountains. By empowering Vietnam and the South China Sea, India creates a direct, structural, geopolitical counterweight right on China's maritime doorstep.
Ah, so you force them to divide their attention.
Exactly. It acts as a strategic force multiplier. India forces a hostile power to manage multiple, highly contested frontiers simultaneously. It drains their resources, fragments their naval focus, and basically makes them look over their shoulder.
Right. It's a clear signal that India is no longer just a South Asian power constrained to its own subcontinent.
Exactly. It is an Indo-Pacific power willing and able to shape outcomes far beyond its own shores.
And all of these bilateral maneuvers we've discussed today, the energy architecture with the UAE, the digital and maritime integration in the Seychelles, the weapon and tech transfers to Vietnam, they do not happen in a vacuum.
No, they all connect.
They eventually collide on the global stage, especially at a time when the established rules of the international order are seemingly breaking down, which brings us to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore.
The 2026 edition was fascinating.
It was basically a masterclass in reading the global strategic pulse.
Yeah, the Shangri-La Dialogue remains Asia's premier defense summit. It is where defense ministers, military chiefs, and intelligence heads gather to lay their cards on the table. And what the 2026 summit highlighted perfectly was exactly what we've been tracking in this briefing.
The merging of the theaters?
Yes, the complete merging of the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific into one continuous, incredibly volatile strategic theater.
The keynote address was actually delivered by Vietnam, which is telling, and they used their platform to highlight what they called a global crisis of trust.
A pointed phrase.
Very. They pointed directly to the rapid erosion of international law and maritime norms, which is a sentiment that was strongly echoed by middle powers, including India. But honestly, the loudest message at the entire summit wasn't spoken at a podium, it was an absence.
Yes, China's glaring absence. For the second year in a row, Beijing did not send its defense minister to the Shangri-La Dialogue. Instead, they sent a lower-level delegation from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army.
Which, in the world of high-level diplomacy, is a massive slight at an event of this caliber.
It is entirely intentional. It signaled Beijing's extreme discomfort with facing united international scrutiny over its aggressive actions toward Taiwan and its expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea.
They didn't want to answer the tough questions.
Right. But more worryingly, it showcased a blatant refusal by the PLA to engage in standard crisis management dialogues, particularly with the United States and its regional allies. The polarization between the two blocs is becoming absolute.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's bring this all together. If we are looking at a global landscape where a major superpower actively refuses to engage in crisis management, and the polarization between U.S. allies and China is basically set in stone, how on earth can India possibly maintain its stated stance of strategic autonomy?
That is the ultimate question.
Because the policy documents make it crystal clear. New Delhi insists that its autonomy is non-negotiable. But can a nation really walk the middle of the road when the road itself is splitting apart? You have the Quad on one side, China on the other, and Russia hovering in the background.
This raises the most important question of all. What does strategic autonomy actually mean in the 21st century? Because it absolutely does not mean neutrality.
Okay, define the difference.
Neutrality is a passive state. It's hiding in a corner, hoping you don't get hit. Autonomy is highly active. India is engaged in a brilliantly complex balancing act. It works deeply with the Quad, which is the strategic security dialogue between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia, to ensure maritime security and contain aggressive expansion in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
At the same time, India is the only Quad member that shares a massive land border with China, which changes its threat calculus entirely. So it maintains historical ties with Russia for legacy military hardware, while simultaneously positioning itself as the champion and voice of the global South.
So autonomy doesn't mean being alone.
Exactly. For India, Autonomy means having the leverage and the strength to act strictly and unapologetically in its own sovereign interest, issue by issue. It means avoiding rigid Cold War-style alliance treaties that drag you into someone else's war.
It's about maximizing your options so that no matter what happens globally, you are never backed into a corner.
Exactly. It is precisely why they are hollowing out rock caverns in Fujairah, rolling out payment apps in the Indian Ocean, and exporting supersonic missiles to Southeast Asia. It is all about maximizing options and expanding strategic depth.
All right, we have debated the intense geopolitical friction points of this briefing. We've mapped the strategy from the underground oil caverns of the West to the highly contested waters of the East. But to ensure this high-stakes briefing permanently sticks in your brain, we're officially initiating the rapid revision and memory anchors. We have exactly 2 minutes left.
I'm Bachman.
If you are taking notes on this shifting map, these are the 5 absolute core concepts you need to remember. Number 1, Fujairah Oil Terminal.
The UAE port, strategically located outside the vulnerable Strait of Hormuz. It guarantees India direct, uninterrupted energy access, even if the Persian Gulf is blockaded.
Number 2, IEP.
The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. This massive logistics network connects India to Europe via the Middle East, bypassing vulnerable, congested maritime routes to secure global trade.
Number 3, Sagar and Mahasagar.
India's maritime doctrines. Security and growth for all in the region. This is aggressively deploying tech and defense like the UPI app and coastal radars in places like the Seychelles to establish area denial.
Number 4, Vietnam, the Act East Pillar.
India's primary defense partner in the South China Sea, collaborating on tech and rare earths, acting as the ultimate geopolitical counterweight to Chinese expansion.
And finally, number 5, the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Asia's premier defense summit, highlighting the merger of the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific into one volatile theater, marked by a global crisis of trust.
All 5 locked in.
But before we officially close this briefing, I want to leave you with a completely different kind of threat to ponder. We spent this entire time discussing how India is securing its maritime geography against hostile nations.
Right.
But as the Indo-Pacific merges into one massive contested chessboard, can a rising superpower truly remain non-aligned when its very economic survival relies on actively arming its neighbors and bypassing global choke points?
That's the structural question.
And furthermore, what happens when the geography itself turns against them? If India's grand strategy relies on underground oil caverns in coastal cities, port infrastructure across the Middle East, and radar stations on fragile island chains like the Seychelles, what happens in 20 or 30 years when climate change and rising sea levels begin to physically submerge those assets?
Wow. Are the geopolitical architects of the 21st century accidentally building a brilliant, impenetrable fortress on sinking sand?
It's something you have to wonder.
That completely changes how you look at the map, doesn't it? The biggest threat to these shipping lanes and island bases might not be a foreign navy, after all. It might just be the ocean itself. Keep that shifting map in your mind. Thanks for joining us in the briefing room today. We'll see you on the next deep dive. If you want to understand the future of India's military and, technological dominance, don't just look at the defense ministry in New Delhi.
Right, exactly. You actually have to look at a water management facility in the Netherlands.
Yeah, or like a melting ice cap off the coast of Norway. I mean, we are operating in a global order that looks way less like a chessboard these days and more like a collapsing supply chain.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. and China are locked in this zero-sum, scorched earth tech war, right?
Right. And Russia is completely bogged down in this grinding war of attrition in Ukraine. The old alliances are fracturing all around us. So for you, as a strategic observer listening to this briefing, the most critical question is, where exactly does India fit into all this chaos?
It fits by executing this truly ruthless surgical redesign of its grand strategy. Because for decades, the standard analytical lens for India's relationship with Europe was clouded, right?
Yeah, clouded by post-colonial nostalgia or those really slow-moving free trade negotiations.
Exactly, and that lens is now entirely obsolete. When we analyze the Prime Minister's 2026 multi-nation tour, we're not looking at some standard diplomatic handshake exercise.
No, not at all.
We are witnessing India using Europe as the ultimate arsenal for its future. I mean, Europe has these specific high-end capabilities required for Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Yeah.
You know, India's doctrine of absolute self-reliance.
And the mission of today's deep dive is to deconstruct that exact operation. We're unpacking India's European pivot, because the reality is, if you want to build a fortress of true self-reliance, you just can't rely on domestic engineering alone in the short term.
No, you have to aggressively acquire those foundational technologies.
Right. And the only block on the planet with the right combo of top-tier military hardware, deep tech manufacturing, and, crucially, the political willingness to actually share it is Europe.
Which is exactly why this pivot starts with the hard power anchors. Because a grand strategy is entirely theoretical if a nation can't, physically defend its sovereign borders and secure its maritime trade routes.
Let's unpack that. The foundation rests heavily on military hardware acquisition from France and Italy, right?
Yes, France is absolutely the linchpin here.
Yep.
Paris offers this really rare proposition in Western diplomacy. They are willing to transfer highly classified advanced military tech without attaching all those stringent, moralistic geopolitical conditions.
Right. They don't demand you perfectly align your foreign policy with theirs before selling you a nuclear reactor or a submarine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They recognize the multipolar reality. And this pragmatism, it's formalized in the Horizon 2047 roadmap.
Which was heavily advanced during this 2026 tour.
Right. We're moving way beyond a simple buyer-seller dynamic here. It's deep structural integration. We're talking securing more Rafale marine fighter jets designed specifically for India's aircraft carriers, joint manufacturing of Scorpene-class stealth submarines,
And those massive energy infrastructure projects like the Jaipur Civil Nuclear Initiative. Plus, France has sovereign island territories in the Indo-Pacific. They're a resident maritime power.
which makes them a totally natural operational ally for the Indian Navy in securing the Indian Ocean.
So France is the heavy hitter for defense, aerospace, and naval platforms. But throwing Italy into this hard power matrix, that's a fascinating strategic shift.
It really is. Historically, Rome's foreign policy has been hyper-focused on their immediate Mediterranean theater.
Right, but now we are seeing Italy adopt this highly pragmatic Indo-Pacific posture, suddenly emerging as a primary defense industrial partner for New Delhi.
Because Italy is adapting to where the global economic center of gravity is moving. They bring formidable naval and aerospace capabilities. We're analyzing these deep engagements with Italian defense conglomerates like Fincantieri.
They specialize in advanced naval shipbuilding, right?
Exactly. And Leonardo, which brings critical aerospace and defense electronics to the Indian market.
And geopolitically, Italy serves as the physical Western anchor for India's most ambitious trade initiative, the IMEC corridor, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. Italy is literally the geographical entry point where goods transition from the Mediterranean Sea onto the European mainland.
Right, so securing a deep alliance with Rome means securing the terminus of your most vital future supply chain.
Yeah.
You get the physical ports and the political goodwill, which ensures IMEC cannot easily be bottlenecked by rival European factions.
Okay, well, here is where we need to strip away the diplomatic pleasantries, because I want to aggressively push back on this narrative of a smooth transition.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I call it the Russian dilemma. Let's look at the sheer multi-billion-dollar volume of this French and Italian hardware being negotiated. The Rafales, the stealth subs, the naval electronics. India is systematically hollowing out its historical reliance on Russian military hardware.
Right.
Are they just quietly ditching Moscow in the defense sector while publicly refusing to condemn the Ukraine war? Because the numbers suggest a pretty brutal, quiet decoupling.
See, that is the defining analytical debate of this entire European pivot. But framing it as a brutal decoupling completely misses the mechanical reality of India's military structure. Up to 60 or 70% of India's legacy military inventory is Russian origin.
Right. It's massive.
You cannot just swap out the engine of a strategic bomber mid-flight. You need spare parts, you need maintenance cycles, and ammunition for platforms that will be in service for another 2 decades.
But Moscow's defense industrial base is totally consumed by their own front lines in Ukraine right now. Their export delivery timelines to New Delhi are severely compromised.
Which creates a desperate, immediate capability gap for India.
Yes.
They are shifting to France and Italy out of pure, urgent necessity. However, a total diplomatic break with Russia, that is India's ultimate geopolitical nightmare.
Because it pushes them toward Beijing.
Exactly. If New Delhi isolates Moscow, Russia becomes entirely financially and strategically dependent on Beijing. A formalized, unified Russia-China axis right on India's northern borders is a catastrophic scenario.
So the strategy is essentially a high-wire act of managed decline. You maintain absolute public neutrality on the Ukraine conflict to keep those diplomatic channels and legacy supply chains with Moscow open,
Yeah.
while surgically replacing all future hardware dependencies with French and Italian systems behind closed doors.
It is a calculated, slow-motion replacement. The hard power modernization just cannot wait for Russia to rebuild its export capacity.
Fair enough. But physical hardware is effectively useless if the underlying digital infrastructure is missing. A next-gen fighter jet or a guided missile is just, well, a sophisticated piece of scrap metal without advanced semiconductors to run the targeting and flight systems.
Absolutely true.
Which brings us to the second phase of this briefing. We are pivoting from the physical battlegrounds of the Mediterranean to the digital battlegrounds of Northern Europe. We need to analyze the Silicon Lifeline.
And when we talk about the Silicon Lifeline, we are talking almost exclusively about the Netherlands. The strategic value of this single nation to India's technological future, it cannot be overstated.
Right. The Netherlands holds this non-negotiable position because of the ASML factor. Let's explain the mechanics here for a second. ASML is a Dutch tech company that holds a functional monopoly on extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, semiconductor lithography.
The printing press of the 21st century digital economy.
Exactly. These are the machines that physically print microscopic circuits onto silicon wafers. They literally use lasers to vaporize droplets of tin, creating a plasma that emits light to carve circuits so small they are measured in individual atoms. Without ASML machinery, you simply cannot manufacture modern microchips.
Period.
If India's national semiconductor mission is going to succeed in building domestic fabrication plants, access to Dutch lithography machines is an existential prerequisite.
And the Dutch control it. But the Netherlands offers India a complete ecosystem play, way beyond just the lithography machines. We have the Port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest seaport, serving as India's primary logistical gateway to flood the broader EU market with exports. And you mentioned the water management facility at the start.
Yes, let's unpack the mechanism of why water matters in a tech war.
Please do.
Semiconductor fabrication plants, or fabs, require millions of gallons of ultra-pure water every single day. The water is used to continuously rinse microscopic chemical debris off the silicon wafers during manufacturing. A severe drought or poor water infrastructure will literally shut down a multi-billion-dollar fab.
And the Dutch have spent centuries engineering climate-resilient water management systems to, prevent their country from sinking into the ocean. India cannot build a secure domestic semiconductor industry without integrating Dutch water management expertise.
Right. And moving north from the Netherlands, we find the innovation engine of this pivot, Sweden. During the 2026 tour, this relationship is elevated to a strategic partnership. The centerpiece here is SI, the Sweden-India Technology and Artificial Intelligence Corridor,
which is designed to deeply integrate their respective AI research ecosystems. But Sweden's value is also heavily anchored in heavy industry and raw materials. We're looking at advanced defense systems from Saab, but more importantly, Sweden's pioneering tech in green steel and extracting critical minerals.
Green steel is a major industrial shift. Manufacturing steel by replacing a heavily polluting coking coal with hydrogen in the reduction process, it strips carbon emissions out of the supply chain.
Right.
And if India is going to transition its massive industrial base away from a reliance on China's heavily polluting coal-based supply chains, and if it wants to avoid future carbon border taxes imposed by Western markets, it desperately needs Swedish green tech.
Because escaping the gravitational pull of Chinese manufacturing and raw material processing is the unspoken subtext of every single agreement signed on this European tour.
Okay, but this brings me to a massive point of friction. I am highly skeptical of the semiconductor lifeline. Let's debate the semiconductor choke point for a second. We just established ASML is a singular digital choke valve. But ASML's lithography technology relies heavily on American patents and American components. We've already seen Washington exert heavy-handed extraterritorial pressure on The Hague to force the Dutch to embargo their most advanced machines from going to China.
That's true.
So if the U.S. can force a sovereign European nation to cut off Beijing, isn't India walking straight into a trap? We are trading a reliance on Chinese hardware for a reliance on European machinery that is ultimately controlled by diplomats in Washington.
Well, that is the most precarious vulnerability in the entire Atmaner-Bharat framework. You are entirely correct. The machinery is Dutch, but the geopolitical leverage is American.
Right.
If India were to take a foreign policy stance that severely displeases Washington, the U.S. has the legal and diplomatic architecture in place to squeeze The Hague, and India's multi-billion-dollar semiconductor mission would be instantly starved of the equipment it needs.
Which means true self-reliance is kind of an illusion. India's digital future is fundamentally tethered to Washington's geopolitical approval. They're leveraging their current strategic convergence with the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific, just assuming that acting as a counterweight to China gives them a permanent geopolitical shield.
But if the political winds in Washington shift, or if the U.S. decides India is getting a little too technologically independent, that shield could vanish overnight. But India's calculation is it's a calculated gamble.
How so?
They believe that by deeply entangling themselves with multiple European economies, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, they make it economically painful for Washington to ever orchestrate a unified embargo against New Delhi.
Which perfectly transitions our briefing to the geographic mechanics of this strategy.
Oh,
Because
boy.
technology and manufacturing capacity mean nothing if you can't secure the physical space to operate, govern the trade routes, and actually access the raw materials, right?
Absolutely.
India is not just targeting the traditional power centers of Paris and Rome, they are heavily flanking the continent. So let's analyze the geographic flanks and the middle power strategy, starting in the far north with Norway.
Norway was upgraded to a green strategic partnership. Now, the headline is green energy, but the strategic core is Arctic governance. Due to accelerating climate change, those polar ice caps are melting, rapidly opening up the northern sea route.
Which provides dramatically shorter shipping lanes between Asia and Europe.
Yes, and it uncovers massive, untapped deposits of critical minerals required for battery manufacturing.
The Arctic is basically the next great geopolitical frontier. I mean, China is aggressively trying to assert dominance by declaring itself a near-Arctic state, despite having literally no territorial claim there.
Exactly. So India requires a seat at the table to prevent a Chinese monopoly on those shipping lanes and resources. Norway is a premier Arctic nation and serves as India's primary guide, anchor, and advocate within the various Arctic governance councils. And let's not forget, Norway operates the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, managing well over $1 trillion.
Right. This represents patient infrastructure capital, and we should define that for you. Patient capital is funding from entities that do not require massive quarterly return.
Right.
A sovereign wealth fund can drop billions into an Indian port or a rail network and patiently wait 20 years for the economic return. India's domestic logistics networks require vast amounts of patient capital to modernize, and Norway is a prime source.
So Norway secures the northern flank and the infrastructure capital. Now we look at the southern and central gateways, Cyprus and Slovakia.
Cyprus is geographically tiny but strategically massive. It's the maritime and financial gateway to the eastern Mediterranean. We noted Italy is the mainland anchor for IMC, but Cyprus is the vital stepping stone right before shipments hit the European continent. It operates as a staging ground. And more importantly, it gives New Delhi a highly valuable diplomatic lever.
Because Cyprus is a full member state of the European Union, which means Nicosia has a voting seat and veto power in the European Council in Brussels.
And then you move inward to Slovakia, representing India's deliberate push into Central Europe. Slovakia brings specialized industrial expertise that India desperately needs to scale. We're talking advanced automotive manufacturing, specifically the rapid development of EV or electric vehicle ecosystems.
Yeah.
Plus, Slovakia possesses deep capability in land systems defense manufacturing. The engineering of armored combat vehicles, artillery, the grinding terrestrial hardware required for land warfare.
Right, and expanding into Central Europe diversifies India's reliance away from just Western European giants like France and Germany.
Okay, but this brings me to my final major strategic challenge. Let's aggressively debate this middle power strategy. I look at this itinerary and I see immense high-level diplomatic hours being spent on tiny nations like Cyprus or Slovakia.
Okay.
This looks incredibly inefficient to me. If India wants deep access to the European single market, advanced tech, and capital, why bypass the capital? Why not just deal directly with the European Union leadership in Brussels? It feels like we are haggling at the local markets instead of just talking to the mayor.
Because treating Brussels like a unified mayor is a fundamental misunderstanding of European mechanics. I mean, dealing with the EU on matters of high-level defense technology or aggressive foreign policy is a bureaucratic nightmare.
Is it that bad?
The EU requires unanimous consensus among all 27 member states to move decisively. Brussels is constantly paralyzed by internal vetoes, endless regulatory debates, and moralistic posturing on trade agreements.
So it's basically a bureaucratic traffic jam.
Exactly. And India does not have the luxury of time. This tech war is happening right now. So India executes a masterful divide-and-conquer strategy. You systematically bypass the institutional deadlock of Brussels, and you basically raid the European technological arsenal country by country.
Wow.
You secure jet fighters from Paris,
Yeah.
lithography from Amsterdam, Arctic access from Oslo, and EV infrastructure from Bratislava.
So it is an aggressive acquisition strategy disguised as a standard diplomatic tour.
Precisely. By cultivating these middle powers through highly targeted bilateral agreements, India rapidly acquires the specific capabilities it lacks domestically. Furthermore, when India is inevitably forced to negotiate comprehensive free trade agreements with a broader EU bloc, having staunch, economically integrated allies like Cyprus, Italy, or Slovakia already inside the tent.
That gives New Delhi immense inside leverage against the bureaucrats in Brussels.
Exactly. The inefficiency you perceive is actually a highly optimized strategy for speed and acquisition.
Well, we have covered a vast expanse of strategic intelligence today, mapping out everything from extreme ultraviolet lithography to Arctic shipping lanes and the tactical evasion of EU bureaucracy.
We really have.
But before we conclude this briefing, we are shifting into a high-retention lockdown. We need to anchor the core intelligence for you. These are the 5 non-negotiable strategic concepts from India's European pivot that you must commit to memory right now.
Concept 1. The Horizon 2047 Roadmap.
This is the sweeping, unconditional strategic framework between India and France. It guarantees long-term co-development of advanced hard power, specifically Rafale marine jets and Scorpene stealth submarines interlocking with civil nuclear and space infrastructure.
Concept 2. ASML and semiconductor lithography.
The Dutch technological monopoly. It is the absolute foundational prerequisite for printing advanced microchips using extreme ultraviolet light. India must secure this machinery to realize its domestic semiconductor ambitions and avoid being locked out of the next digital age.
Concept 3. SciTech, the Sweden-India Technology and AI Corridor.
The newly established innovation pipeline. It integrates AI ecosystems and provides India access to green steel and critical minerals, serving as the primary mechanism to decouple India's industrial base from heavily polluting Chinese supply chains.
Concept 4. Arctic governance.
The strategic driver behind the Norway partnership. It secures India's logistical and scientific access to the rapidly melting polar shipping routes and untapped critical minerals, effectively countering China's attempt to monopolize the newly accessible Northern Sea route.
Concept 5. The Eastern Mediterranean Theater.
The vital geostrategic zone anchored by Cyprus and Italy. It serves as the western maritime terminus for the IM's trade corridor, ensuring India has a secure, highly influential entry point into the broader European mainland.
Those are your anchors.
But before we close, let's look at the ultimate consequence of this pivot. We've established that India is systematically extracting European technology to build Atmanirbhar Bharat to become a completely self-reliant superpower.
Right. And this is the critical variable. India is masterfully using Europe as its technological arsenal to build its own self-reliance. But you have to wonder, if India's Atmanirbhar Bharat succeeds completely, will Europe wake up one day to realize it didn't just arm a partner, but engineered a self-sufficient superpower that literally no longer needs it?
A profound dynamic that will reshape the next decade of global power. Thank you for joining us for this briefing. We will see you in the next deep dive.
Take a look at the smartphone in your pocket right now, or, maybe the electric vehicle sitting in your driveway. Have you ever actually wondered what happens if the country that manufactures the very building blocks of that technology just suddenly decides to turn off the tap?
It's a terrifying thought, honestly.
Right, it is. So today we are going deep into a massive stack of intelligence assessments, think tank white papers, and diplomatic cables leading up into 2026. Our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack what is arguably the most complex, high-stakes diplomatic balancing act in modern history. We're talking about India's grand strategy for survival.
And survival really is the operative word here, because if you're still relying on those old 20th century paradigms of global power, you're probably picturing like tank battalions massing on borders.
Yeah, or aircraft carriers cutting through the ocean, that kind of thing.
Exactly. We've been conditioned to view hard power as kinetic, visible, measurable.
Right, you're always looking for the literal explosions. But going through this research, it just becomes glaringly obvious that if you step into the rooms where actual grand strategy is being drafted right now, the map looks completely different. I mean, the modern battlefield isn't defined by infantry divisions anymore. It's defined by supply chains.
It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. The new great game isn't being fought over territory in the traditional sense at all. It is a desperate global scramble for critical minerals.
Things like lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements.
Yes, exactly. These are the fundamental building blocks of the 21st century. I mean, you cannot build EV batteries, you can't manufacture advanced semiconductors, and you certainly cannot assemble fifth-generation fighter jets without them.
And here is the core friction point that we're exploring today. So India is trying to secure its economic future, right, and modernize its military. But its biggest geopolitical rival, which is China, already has a near total stranglehold on the exact materials needed to do that.
A complete monopoly.
Right. So how does India break that monopoly without triggering a direct conflict? From the sources we're looking at, it seems like India is building this massive dual architecture. On one hand, they are deeply integrating with the U.S. and the West, and on the other, they are aggressively positioning themselves as the leader of the global South.
That's exactly it. And to understand how India plans to dismantle this supply chain monopoly, we really have to start by dissecting its critical alliances. And, well, that begins with the United States.
Okay.
If we look closely at the 2026 visit of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio to India, the strategic goal was very clearly a reset.
Because there had been some pretty serious friction, right? I mean, the papers mention emerging trust deficits over trade tariffs, and obviously the West has been pretty frustrated with India's continued relationship with Russia.
Precisely. They have. But the underlying reality, the reason the U.S. is willing to smooth over those issues is that for India, the U.S. is the indispensable partner. And it all comes down to advanced technology transfers.
Right. You can't just invent that stuff overnight.
You really can't. You cannot build a modern high-tech defense industrial base in a vacuum. You need jet engine technology, you need advanced semiconductor tooling, and frankly, the U.S. holds those keys.
And this tech partnership is really the engine driving the Quad's geoeconomic pivot. I mean, for a long time, the Quad, which is India, the U.S., Japan, and Australia, it kind of felt like a diplomatic talking shop.
Yeah, a lot of handshakes.
Exactly. They'd meet, release a statement about a free and open Indo-Pacific and, take a photo. But our sources highlight a massive shift here. The launch of the Quad Critical Minerals Initiative.
And this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
I mean, shared democratic values are great for press conferences, but shared supply chains actually win conflicts.
Yeah.
This initiative is about actively coordinating joint investments in mineral processing. It's about running collaborative geological surveys and creating strategic stockpiles.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this because I want to challenge the timeline here.
Okay.
The initiative sounds great on paper, but China has a 15-year head start in processing rare earths. And from what I understand, refining these minerals isn't just about digging dirt out of the ground.
No, none at all.
Right? It requires incredibly complex chemical engineering, and you're dealing with highly toxic radioactive byproducts. China was willing to absorb that massive environmental cost for decades, while the West just happily outsourced it to them.
They absolutely were.
So is it even mathematically possible for India and the Quad to build these clean refineries fast enough to survive a potential geopolitical blockade?
Well, look, that is the multi-trillion-dollar question. If you isolate India's capabilities, yeah, it looks impossible. But you have to look at the combined geoeconomic weight of the Quad. You are merging American capital, Japanese advanced precision manufacturing, Australian raw resources, and Indian scale and human capital.
So Voltron, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Yes, China has a 15-year head start, but they achieved that in a relatively permissive global environment where, as you said, everyone was happy to let them do the dirty work. That environment is now actively hostile to Chinese supply chain dominance. So the coordinated capital being deployed by the Quad is designed to compress that 15-year gap into maybe 5.
It honestly reminds me of playing a high-stakes global game of Catan.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. You're sitting around the board, and suddenly everyone realizes they all need the exact same ore and brick to build their settlements. But worse, you realize one player controls all the ports, and the robber is permanently sitting on your only resource tile. You just have to find a new place to build.
That is a brilliant way to look at it, and the search for those new resource tiles pushes the map directly toward the African theater.
Right, which brings us to the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit in 2026. This summit is essentially the ultimate resource rush. Africa holds massive untapped deposits of lithium, cobalt, and graphite. But how India is playing its hand in Africa, that's what really caught my attention in these think tank briefs.
Yeah, through the India-Africa Vision 2035, India isn't just showing up with bulldozers and mining equipment.
No, they're not.
They are deliberately contrasting themselves with China. They are offering capacity building, healthcare infrastructure, and most importantly, they are exporting their digital public infrastructure.
Like the UPI payment system.
Yeah.
This blew my mind when I was reading it. So instead of building a massive physical highway and sadly an African nation with opaque debt, like we've seen with China's Belt and Road Initiative, India is essentially giving them the software infrastructure to run a modern digital economy.
Exactly. It is a masterstroke of soft power.
It really is.
It creates a deep structural dependency on Indian technology without the bad optics of predatory loans or debt traps. It leapfrogs traditional banking and integrates these developing economies directly with India's tech sector.
So they're framing themselves as the non-predatory alternative.
Yeah.
The nice guy, anti-China partner. But I have to push back here. Being the nice guy sounds wonderful in a diplomatic press release. But is giving a country a digital payment system actually enough to secure the physical mines when your competitor, China, has absolutely bottomless pockets and is willing to just buy the land outright?
It is a calculated gamble, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And India is betting heavily that African nations have watched the last decade of debt trap diplomacy and learned some very hard lessons. They are betting that sovereignty actually matters to these nations. But you're right to point out the harsh physical reality.
What?
Which leads us to an even bigger vulnerability in this grand strategy. Let's say India successfully charms its way into securing the lithium and cobalt in Africa.
Okay.
That victory is completely useless if the cargo ships bringing those minerals back to Indian ports are vulnerable on the open ocean.
Oh, because if you look at the map, every single one of those cargo ships essentially has to pass through the Strait of Malacca. And if a rival navy chokes that strait, India's entire EV revolution and tech modernization just dies on the water.
Precisely. Which means we have to look at how India is shifting from geoeconomics to hard maritime security. And the absolute anchor for this strategy in Southeast Asia is Indonesia.
The strategic synergy with Indonesia is just fascinating. First, you have the mineral aspect. Indonesia has massive nickel reserves, which are absolutely vital for EV batteries. And the research shows a deep integration of their steel and mineral supply chains, highlighted by massive joint ventures between India's SAIL and Indonesia's PT Krakatau Steel.
But the economic integration is just the foundation. If you analyze the Prime Minister's 2026 visit to Indonesia, it wasn't just about steel and batteries.
Right.
This marked a massive, undeniable shift from India's traditional diplomatic Act East policy to unapologetic hard security. Indonesia is set to become the third Southeast Asian nation to operate India's BrahMos missile system.
Okay, we need to pause here because exporting the BrahMos is arguably India's most aggressive geopolitical move on the board. We are talking about a highly advanced supersonic cruise missile.
The very capable weapon, yes.
But isn't this incredibly dangerous? I mean, the theory is that arming the Philippines, Vietnam, and now Indonesia keeps the Chinese PLA Navy bogged down in the South China Sea. But doesn't arming China's maritime neighbors risk provoking a direct, devastating retaliation right on India's doorstep up in the Himalayas on the line of actual control?
Well, it is definitely an escalation.
Aren't they poking the dragon a little too hard here?
Look, you have to understand how strategic deterrence operates. It's a two-way street. For decades, China has armed India's neighbors, Pakistan being the most obvious example.
Sure.
And they did that specifically to keep India boxed into the subcontinent, managing local crises so it couldn't look outward. By exporting the BrahMos, India is simply flipping the script.
So they are essentially saying, if you make us worry about our borders, we're going to make you worry about your coastline.
Exactly. It creates a second front for Chinese strategic calculus. It forces Beijing to expend resources and attention defending its maritime flanks. Yes, there is a constant risk of friction on the Himalayan border, but the absence of deterrence is infinitely more dangerous than the presence of it.
That's a strong point.
You don't prevent aggression by remaining vulnerable. You prevent it by making the cost of aggression unacceptably high.
Right, a calculated escalation to force a stalemate. And they are tying this hard deterrence together with incredible intelligence integration. The reports detail how Indonesia is deploying a liaison officer to India's IFC-IOR.
The Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region.
Right.
This is the nervous system of India's maritime strategy. What sending a liaison actually means in practice is that Indonesian radar data, shipping logs, and intelligence are feeding directly into a massive operations room in India.
So they are creating a unified surveillance network. You literally cannot hide a submarine or a rogue cargo ship if India and Indonesia are sharing real-time data to lock eyes on the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits.
It's a package deal of economic survival and high deterrence. On one hand, India is signing joint ventures for nickel to build eco-friendly EVs, and in the very next breath, they are exporting supersonic offensive missiles and integrating military radar over global choke points.
It is pragmatism in its absolute purest form,
Mm-hmm.
but running this sprawling military-industrial complex and securing an entire ocean requires one thing above all else right now:
Energy.
immense amounts of
Wow.
energy. You can't run a transitional economy purely on solar panels today. And this forces India into some deeply pragmatic and, frankly, controversial choices.
Which is clearly visible in the Venezuela pivot. The geopolitical situation in the Gulf has been incredibly tense, directly threatening crude oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
India couldn't just sit back and hope the global markets stabilize. They looked west to Latin America.
In 2026, we saw the acting president of Venezuela visit India, marking a major resumption of heavy crude purchases. And we have to highlight the friction here, because this is happening despite a highly complex web of Western sanctions.
Right.
And this is what I want to challenge you on: the ethics and the absolute limits of this multi-alignment strategy.
Okay, let's get into it.
Look, India is buying massive amounts of oil from Venezuela, and obviously they've been buying discounted oil from Russia for a while. This completely defies Western sanctions logic. Yet simultaneously, as we just discussed, India is demanding high-end defense tech, jet engines, and intelligence sharing from the U.S. and France.
Yes, they are.
So how long can India play all sides? At what point does Washington or Paris slam their fist on the table and demand exclusive loyalty?
The blunt reality. They won't demand exclusive loyalty because they physically cannot afford to.
Wait, really? You don't think there's a breaking point?
I really don't. The West's entire grand strategy for a free and open Indo-Pacific collapses overnight without India's geography, its military mass, and its demographic scale. The United States is willing to look the other way on Venezuelan heavy crude or Russian discounted oil because keeping India economically stable and militarily strong enough to counter China is the supreme strategic priority.
So it's not a bug in their foreign policy.
No, not at all. Multi-alignment is a feature. It is a feature that the West has begrudgingly accepted. I mean, India is not the non-aligned India of the Cold War, just quietly sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
This is active, aggressive balancing. They are extracting maximum value from every single pole of global power.
And the contrast is just stunning.
Yeah.
You have this gritty, raw energy pragmatism where they are buying sanctioned oil just to keep the lights on. And then just a few months later, you look at India's ideological stance at the 52nd G7 summit in France.
Right, because India uses the G7 as a bridge. They aren't going to these summits to blindly align with Western talking points. They are standing in the middle of the wealthiest Western nations and aggressively demanding equitable climate finance.
Yeah.
They are pushing for inclusive AI governance so the global south isn't left behind. They are demanding structural reforms of the UN and the World Bank.
There was a defining quote from the Prime Minister at that G7 summit that I think perfectly encapsulates the entire strategy. He told the assembled Western leaders, "The world faces a shortage of trust, not resources."
That is the trust deficit doctrine in a nutshell. It is India's ultimate diplomatic weapon right now.
How so?
Well, if you think about why the global south is hesitant to fully back the West, vaccine hoarding during the pandemic, unfulfilled climate finance promises, India is weaponizing that history. They are looking at the U.S. and Europe and saying, look, you have the capital, you have the advanced technology, but you have fundamentally lost the trust of the developing world.
And we have that trust.
Exactly. We have it. If you want to counter China globally, you have to work through us.
It's a remarkable narrative shift. They are positioning themselves as the indispensable bridge. Okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of strategic ground today. We've looked at the supply chains, the military deterrence, the energy pragmatism. Before we close, I want to make sure we lock this big picture into your mental map. If you are tracking this at home, let's distill this massive board we just explored into the core pillars you need to remember permanently. Let's do a rapid-fire recap.
I'm ready. Let's start with the foundation. The Quad Critical Minerals Initiative. Remember, this isn't just a diplomatic talking point anymore. It is a heavily capitalized joint India, US, Japan, Australia strategy designed to systematically compress China's 15-year lead and break their global monopoly over rare earths and lithium supply chains.
Excellent. And to protect those supply chains, you have the IFC-IOR, the Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region. This is that massive operations room, the Maritime Intelligence Hub. By integrating Indonesian radar and shipping data, they are completely locking down surveillance over the most critical naval choke points on Earth, the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits.
Which then allows them to confidently project power into Africa through IAFFAV and the India-Africa Vision 2035. This is the massive diplomatic push to secure African critical minerals. But the key takeaway here is the method, presenting India as the non-predatory alternative to Chinese debt trap diplomacy by exporting digital public infrastructure like the UPI.
Got it. Meanwhile, they are projecting hard power into Southeast Asia through BrahMos diplomacy. This is the active exportation of advanced supersonic offensive missiles to nations like Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. It is a direct, calculated strategy to arm China's neighbors, force Beijing to look south, and actively deter Chinese naval expansion.
And finally, all of this operates under the overarching doctrine of multi-alignment. This is the complex, highly pragmatic act of maintaining elite strategic and technological partnerships with the West while simultaneously leading the global South and preserving totally independent energy policies, whether that means buying from the US, Russia, or Venezuela.
It is a phenomenal balancing act, and that locks in the briefing for today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the new great game.
But before we completely sign off, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We've detailed exactly how India is balancing against Chinese hegemony by arming the global South with advanced missiles, integrating global intelligence, and aggressively securing its own independent supply chains. But if this grand strategy is perfectly successful, if India builds an impenetrable military-industrial complex and commands the absolute loyalty of the global South, does it eventually become the very unilateral hegemon it currently claims to be balancing against?
Man, that is definitely something to think about the next time you look at the shifting lines on the map. This concludes the deep dive. See you next time.
If you were to walk into a high-level strategic war room maybe 20 years ago, you'd see these massive maps on the walls, right? Just covered in pins.
Oh, absolutely. Red and blue pins everywhere.
Right, but those pins would be marking troop movements or naval fleets or contested physical borders. Today, if you walk into that exact same room, the map is still there, but the pins have completely changed.
They're not military targets anymore.
Exactly. Now they are marking a semiconductor plant in Taiwan or a lithium mine in Africa, maybe a deep water port in Sri Lanka, or a shipping lane in the Red Sea. You are listening to this briefing because the very definition of national security has fundamentally shifted. Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah, consider this your classified-style intelligence briefing on the new rules of global survival.
Because it is a massive paradigm shift. For decades, foreign policy was basically dictated by military posture.
Right, but now we're no longer just guarding physical borders. We are guarding supply chains. That is the new front line.
And the structural shocks of the last few years, like the COVID-19 pandemic shutting down global transit, the war in Ukraine completely freezing energy markets.
The ongoing paralysis in the Red Sea, too.
Yeah, the Red Sea disrupting commercial shipping. These didn't just cause logistical headaches for companies. They proved unequivocally that economic choke points are the ultimate weapons of the 21st century.
It's terrifying when you really think about it. If you can choke a supply chain, you can paralyze an entire nation's defense apparatus. You can shut down their economic grid without, firing a single shot.
And that is exactly the battlefield we're mapping out for you today. Our mission in this briefing is to really deconstruct how India is aggressively rewiring its entire global economic strategy to survive this new era.
We're analyzing a master plan, really.
Right.
One designed to break monopolies on critical minerals, to tear up and just completely renegotiate flawed trade pacts.
And even to weaponize massive global spectacles for economic expansion. But identifying a threat on a digital radar doesn't actually stop the threat, right?
No, not at all. Knowing you're going to run out of raw materials is entirely useless if you don't have a system to detect the shortage before it happens.
Which brings us to the Global Supply Chain Observatory, the GSG. India officially integrated into this in 2026. Think of it as a military early warning radar system, but built entirely for macroeconomic trade.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of tracking an incoming ballistic missile, this radar is pinging, say, a cyber threat hitting a shipping port in Rotterdam.
Or a sudden labor strike in some South American region that processes rare earth metal.
Right. And the mechanism behind the GSCO is what makes it so unprecedented. I mean, this isn't just a static database. It is a live international intelligence network.
Partner nations pooling real-time algorithmic threat assessment.
Exactly. Let's look at how this functions on the ground. Say a specialized chemical facility in Eastern Europe suddenly goes offline, like a localized power grid failure.
Previously, an Indian manufacturer wouldn't even know about this until, 3 weeks later when their shipment just didn't arrive.
Yeah, and by then, the assembly line completely stops. You're dead in the water. But with the GSCO, the data integration flags that grid failure instantly.
It tracks exactly which global shipping manifests are impacted.
Yes, and it allows the Indian government or even the private sector to immediately execute a backup contract with a supplier in, let's say, Australia.
So it basically buys you time. And in global logistics, time is literally the difference between a minor price fluctuation and a catastrophic industrial shutdown.
Precisely. Which brings us to the physical backbone of this strategy. Because look, a digital early warning system only works if you actually have backup suppliers to call upon.
Right, you need the physical assets. To secure the tech future, India is executing some very targeted, almost surgical physical partnerships.
The UK Critical Minerals Partnership is a prime example of this.
Yeah, let's look at that one first, because this goes far beyond a standard bilateral trade agreement. It is laser-focused on the foundational elements of the future economy. We're talking lithium, cobalt, and rare earths.
India and the UK are launching joint investments into mining, but more importantly, into advanced recycling technologies.
To extract these minerals from dead batteries and discarded electronics, right?
Exactly. The recycling component is the absolute linchpin of the strategy. It's explicitly designed to bypass the current global monopoly.
Because China has held a total stranglehold on the processing and refining of critical minerals for over a decade.
They might not mine all the lithium in the world, but they refine the vast majority of it. So if you want to build green energy grids or, modernize a defense force with advanced drones,
You are essentially at the mercy of Chinese supply lines.
you are. But by partnering with the UK to develop these proprietary recycling technologies, India is basically creating a domestic secondary mine.
You extract the materials you already have within your own borders, reducing that reliance on importing newly refined Chinese minerals. But the UK is only handling the intellectual property and the raw material processing side of the equation. Processing the materials doesn't mean much if you can't transport them or turn them into actual technology.
That's where you have to look east, to Japan.
Right. At the 16th India-Japan Annual Summit, the deepening of their semiconductor partnership wasn't just about sharing microchip blueprints, was it?
Not at all. Japan brings the financing for the heavy, physical infrastructure required to make a domestic semiconductor industry even remotely possible.
We are talking about high-speed rail and dedicated freight corridors.
Yeah, because semiconductor fabrication plants, the fabs, are incredibly resource-intensive. They require billions of gallons of ultra-pure water.
And flawless, uninterrupted power grids.
And a logistics network that can move highly sensitive equipment seamlessly. Imagine trying to move like $1 billion worth of delicate semiconductor manufacturing equipment from a port to an inland facility.
On a congested two-lane highway. Yeah, good luck with that.
It simply doesn't work. Japan is financing the physical arteries, these massive electrified rail networks, strictly for freight. That allows the materials to flow.
Because you can have all the critical minerals in the world, but if your domestic logistics network cannot move them efficiently from the port to the factory floor, your supply chain is still broken.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on. I have to challenge the foundational logic of this entire architecture here.
Okay, let's hear it.
We're celebrating this UK partnership for green tech, right?
Oh.
And we are touting these Japanese financed factories. But let's look at the actual reality on the ground for a second.
Sure.
To even construct these advanced processing plants in India, we are heavily reliant on importing Chinese heavy machinery to pour the concrete, build the turbines, and run the foundational chemical processing.
That is true, yes.
So if our entire supposedly independent alternative node requires Chinese equipment to even function at the ground level, aren't we just adding an incredibly expensive British or Japanese middleman?
I see where you're going with this.
Like, are we actually decoupling from China at all? Or is it just window dressing?
That is the defining geopolitical friction point for analysts right now, and it's a vital debate to have. The reality that policymakers have had to accept is that true, absolute decoupling is an illusion.
An illusion. So we are pouring billions of dollars into a strategic shell game.
No, it's not a shell game, but the objective has been radically redefined. The goal is no longer isolation. The goal is de-risking.
De-risking. Okay, explain the difference.
You're absolutely correct that extracting every single Chinese element from a globalized supply chain is functionally impossible in the short term.
The heavy machinery and chemical precursors are just too deeply embedded.
Exactly. But what this strategy does, what the UK and Japan partnerships actually achieve, is the elimination of the single point of failure.
Meaning you remove the ability of a single hostile actor to hold a gun to the entire system's head.
Precisely. In geoeconomics, if you have only one supplier for a critical component, that supplier essentially dictates your foreign policy. They own you. But if you have 3 suppliers, even if one of those secondary suppliers still relies on Chinese subcomponents, you have created leverage. You have options.
So the illusion of decoupling is thinking you can build this impenetrable fortress wall. But the reality of de-risking is building alternative, redundant nodes so that a single choke point cannot cause a total systemic collapse.
You nailed it. That's the exact strategy.
All right. But if we are aggressively building these domestic alternative nodes, we have to address how trade actually moves across our borders.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you cannot de-risk your economy if your borders are structurally leaking. This brings us to a massive, widening trade deficit crisis. And it goes by the acronym AITGA.
The ASEAN-India Trade and Goods Agreement, originally signed back in 2009.
And since its inception, it has been a total strategic nightmare for Indian domestic manufacturing.
It really has. The geopolitical logic in 2009 was the Act East policy, right? Integrating the Indian economy with the booming markets of Southeast Asia.
The theory was sound, but the execution was highly flawed.
Because Indian exports ended up slamming into a wall of non-tariff barriers.
Let's be very clear about what that actually means, because a non-tariff barrier isn't just a direct tax on a good.
No, it's far more insidious. It's a sudden, arbitrary quality inspection at a foreign port that leaves, say, Indian pharmaceuticals rotting in a warehouse for 6 months.
Or incredibly complex licensing rules or environmental certifications that are uniquely designed to be impossible for Indian engineering goods to pass.
Exactly. And meanwhile, Southeast Asian goods just flood into India and our trade deficit balloons.
But the real structural crisis isn't just our trade imbalance with ASEAN, it's how third parties are actively exploiting the very architecture of the agreement.
Which brings us to the rules of origin loophole.
Right. In international trade law, rules of origin are the criteria used to determine the true, quote-unquote, economic nationality of a product.
Yes. So if India signs a free trade agreement with Vietnam, it's supposed to ensure that only goods genuinely produced in Vietnam get tariff-free access to Indian markets.
But historically, under AITGA, we've seen massive exploitation of this rule.
Massive. Chinese goods, which normally would face steep tariffs to enter India, are shipped to an ASEAN nation, minimally processed.
Sometimes just repackaged into a new cardboard box.
Literally. And then routed directly into India duty-free.
It is the exact equivalent of installing a state-of-the-art security system on your front door, but leaving the back window wide open, and the neighbor is just handing the burglar a VIP pass through the garden.
It's absurd. How does a customs agent look at a crate of electronics and prove the microchips inside weren't just snapped into a plastic casing in Malaysia to avoid a 20% tariff?
Tracking the actual value addition is notoriously difficult, and for years, enforcement was incredibly lax.
It facilitated massive Chinese dumping through a back door, which severely hollowed out Indian domestic manufacturing.
That is exactly why the ongoing 2026 AITGA review is so aggressive. India is specifically demanding strict, verifiable value addition percentages.
The enforcement of rules of origin is now completely non-negotiable.
The objective is to shut that back door permanently, halt the subsidized dumping, and force Southeast Asian markets to actually dismantle their non-tariff barriers against Indian goods.
But blocking that back door creates an immediate vacuum, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If we stem the flow of cheap manufactured goods coming to the country, we have to fill that massive gap ourselves, or consumer prices will just skyrocket.
Which triggers the domestic counteroffensive. Enter Farad Tech's 2026 and the PM MITRA parks.
You cannot block a global supply chain without providing a viable structural alternative.
Right. Frotex was positioned as India's largest global textile exhibition. But if you read it between the lines, it was really a massive geoeconomic showcase.
It was a signal to the world that India is ready to be the primary alternative for global apparel and textile sourcing.
And we need to clarify what we mean by textiles here.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about fast fashion, cotton t-shirts, and bed sheets.
No, people often forget that textiles are India's second largest employment generator right after agriculture. It is a massive pillar of the domestic economy.
Which is why the PM-IPRA parks are so critical to this strategy.
PMAITRA. That stands for a Mega Integrated Textile Region and Apparel Parks. These are colossal manufacturing hubs designed with plug-and-play infrastructure.
Let's break down plug and play, because it sounds like a Silicon Valley corporate buzzword. What does that actually look like on the ground for a manufacturer?
It means they don't have to spend 5 years navigating local bureaucracy, bribing officials for a water permit, or fighting for land acquisition.
They just walk onto a massive, pre-approved plot of land where the heavy power grids, the specialized chemical waste management systems, and the direct rail spurs to the ports are already fully built and operational by the government.
They literally just construct the warehouse, plug in the machinery, and start producing. And the deliberate strategic push here isn't just basic apparel, it is into technical textiles.
Right, technical textiles.
Yeah.
We're talking about Kevlar and ballistic weaves for defense manufacturing.
Sterile antimicrobial mesh for medical equipment.
And flame-retardant composites for the automotive and aerospace industries.
Exactly. As global brands and multinational corporations desperately look to diversify their sourcing away from China to avoid geopolitical risk, these PM-IMITRA parks are purpose-built to absorb that exact, highly lucrative, highly specialized market share.
It's a very aggressive, very smart play.
Okay, but time for a serious reality check here. Let's look at the strategic friction, the free trade dilemma.
Let's dive in.
On one hand, you're arguing that Tega gutted our manufacturing, so we need strict rules of origin, we need to aggressively protect our PM-IMITRA parks, and we need to defend our infant industries from Chinese dumping.
Yes.
I understand the logic,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, India desperately needs to integrate into global value chains. You do not become a global superpower by keeping your economy under a glass dome.
That's a fair point.
If our trade negotiators march into these ASEAN meetings throwing their weight around and making heavy protectionist demands, AirTag is a massive booming market. They don't have to wait for us.
No, they don't.
They will just integrate further with China or South Korea. Aren't we just going to isolate India? Can we genuinely afford to put up defensive walls while simultaneously trying to become the world's next great exporter?
You have just outlined the exact tightrope that Indian policymakers are walking right now. And it is a fierce, ongoing debate within the highest levels of government.
Because if you lean too far into protectionism, yes, you isolate yourself.
Capital is like water. It flows along the path of least resistance. Global supply chains will simply route around you. You become a fortress, but an incredibly poor one.
Exactly. If our borders are too rigid, the rest of Asia will just do business with everyone else and leave us behind.
But look at the counterargument, which is heavily driving current policy. If you maintain the historical status quo of agreements like AITGA under the guise of, quote, integration, you aren't actually integrating into a value chain.
You're just becoming a consumer dumping ground.
Yes, you cannot maintain an Act East policy if it results in the absolute hollowing out of your own domestic engineering and manufacturing base.
So the argument for strict rules of origin isn't just blind reactionary protectionism.
Not at all. It is a matter of pure industrial survival. The historical logic, the exact same logic used by the United States and China during their own economic rises, by the way, is that you cannot be a global exporter if your domestic industries are smothered in their crib by subsidized foreign dumping before they can scale up.
You have to secure your base, build your capacity in places like the PM-MITRA parks, and then project economic power outward from a position of strength.
It is about demanding fair, reciprocal integration rather than just integration at the cost of your own sovereignty.
Which is a perfect transition into our final intelligence briefing, because we need to talk about unconventional methods of projecting that economic power outward.
This is fascinating. The strategy here might be the most counterintuitive part of this entire deep dive.
We are talking about the economics of spectacle. Let's look at the 2026 FIFA World Cup.
Hosted jointly by the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Right. Now, as a strategic analyst, you might be wondering, Why on earth are we analyzing a football tournament in a macroeconomic security briefing?
A fair question.
But if you look past the pitch, if you ignore the sport entirely, what you see is a masterclass in trilateral logistics.
Border management, high-level security coordination across 3 massive sovereign nations, facilitating a 48-team event and millions of international travelers.
It is the ultimate real-time stress test for a nation's infrastructure.
Exactly. Mega sporting events are no longer just cultural games. They are massive, high-yield engines for foreign direct investment and global branding.
And for India, as it heavily eyes future Olympic hosting aspirations, the 2026 World Cup serves as the direct strategic blueprint.
It is about utilizing sports diplomacy as an instrument of hard economic development.
Okay, I am going to throw a massive red flag on this play.
Oh, here we go.
I have to push back fiercely on the ROI, the return on investment of this strategy.
Okay.
We are talking about hosting mega events that cost tens of billions of dollars.
They're very expensive, yes.
We have all seen the photographs of the graveyards of abandoned, rusting stadiums in Athens or Rio after the Olympics leave town. For a developing nation like India, does the prestige, the soft power, and a temporary bump in tourism genuinely justify that kind of massive capital expenditure?
It's a huge risk.
Isn't this just a colossal vanity project? Shouldn't those billions be strictly reserved for hard infrastructure, upgrading the power grids, and modernizing the defense force?
It is an entirely valid critique.
Yeah.
And the history of Olympic host cities is undeniably mixed, I'll give you that. But you have to look at the mechanism of what sports diplomacy actually achieves in a developing context.
Which is what?
It isn't about the stadiums. The stadiums are just the necessary stage. Think of an event of that magnitude as a bureaucratic bypass valve.
A bypass valve for what? For red tape?
Exactly. Normally, building a new subway system, expanding an international airport, or laying down a modernized telecom network in a major city takes 15 years of environmental reviews, political bickering, and bureaucratic inertia.
Right, it gets bogged down forever.
But when the IOC or FIFA says, the entire world is showing up on July 10th, and the cameras go live at 8 p.m., the bureaucratic friction suddenly vanishes.
The hard, immovable deadline forces the infrastructure into existence.
The transport links get built, the security grids get modernized, and long after the athletes fly home, those modernized cities, those upgraded power grids, they remain.
Wow.
Furthermore, it fundamentally alters a nation's global business branding. It signals to international investors that the country has the logistical capability, the security apparatus, and the political will to execute on a massive, highly complex scale.
So that soft power translates directly into hard economic leverage at the negotiating table. The spectacle is merely the catalyst. The real game is the permanent infrastructure left behind.
Precisely.
Okay, we've covered an immense amount of strategic ground in this briefing. We have moved from digital early warning systems, tracking cyber threats, to the realities of de-risking our tech future, to plugging the loopholes in our trade pacts.
And finally, to using global spectacles to force urban modernization.
Now, as promised, we are going to shift gears. We need to lock these concepts into your memory right now. We are moving into rapid revision.
If you are briefing the Prime Minister tomorrow, these are the 5 critical concepts you need instantly at your fingertips.
Let's run it. Concept 1, GSCO, the Global Supply Chain Observatory. This is the International Early Warning Intelligence Platform.
It monitors and prevents disruptions in the flow of critical commodities and semiconductors. It is the digital radar for the modern economy.
Concept 2, the ATIGA Review. This is the aggressive renegotiation of the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement.
Its specific strategic purpose is to demand strict value addition percentages and block Chinese goods from sneaking through the back door into the Indian market via Southeast Asia.
Concept 3, PM-META parks. These are the mega manufacturing hubs equipped with plug-and-play infrastructure.
Their entire purpose is to rapidly scale up India's domestic apparel and technical textile industry to absorb the global supply chains that are currently fleeing Chinese markets.
Concept 4, rules of origin. The vital international trade criteria currently being weaponized. It determines the true economic national source of a product.
Enforcing it rigorously is the only way to track value addition and stop third-party dumping from destroying domestic manufacturing.
And Concept 5, sports diplomacy. The strategic utilization of mega events following the 2026 World Cup blueprint.
It is not about the sport. It is about projecting soft power to create a hard deadline that forces rapid urban infrastructure development and attracts massive foreign investment.
You now have the full strategic picture. You see exactly how the pins on the map have moved. You see how India is fighting to build redundant alternative nodes, aggressively plug the leaks in its international trade pacts, and force rapid modernization to secure its place in a world where trade itself is a weapon.
It's a completely new battlefield.
But I want to leave you with one final thought. We have spent this entire briefing analyzing how India is meticulously mapping out global vulnerabilities, building early warning radars, and securing its own future against economic choke points.
Which raises the most important and perhaps the most chilling strategic question of all for an analyst.
What's that?
If economic choke points are indeed the ultimate weapons of the 21st century, and India is meticulously mapping the globe to secure its own supply chains, who is currently mapping out India's choke points?
Something to think about the next time you look at a map. Keep diving deep. Right now, deep in the monazite sands off the coast of Kerala lies the answer to a geopolitical nightmare that usually starts with a cheap, $200 drone strike thousands of miles away in the Red Sea.
It really is incredible when you connect those dots.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to this deep dive. We are opening a highly authoritative strategic briefing today, looking at the raw intelligence shaping India's future as a superpower.
Right.
We are pulling apart everything from currency crashes and, shifting nuclear doctrines, all the way to the militarization of pristine tropical islands. The mission for you, listening right now, is to basically see the matrix, to understand how these seemingly totally disconnected global events form one ruthless, unified strategy for national survival in the year 2026.
Exactly, because the illusion we often fall for is that the global order is held together by, elegant trade agreements and diplomatic handshakes in Geneva.
Right, which sounds nice on paper.
But it's just not reality. The intelligence on the table today proves otherwise. Soft power is a luxury. Trade agreements are entirely meaningless if a nation cannot secure the sheer caloric energy required to keep its grid running. Or, if it lacks the hard power capability to deter a nuclear-armed adversary from just crossing its borders.
So it's about raw survival.
We are mapping out a massive, interconnected puzzle of exactly that: state survival.
So let's get straight into the economic front line, because the numbers here paint a stark, immediate vulnerability. I mean, we are talking about West Asia and the absolute fragility of the Indian rupee.
Yeah, the raw data reveals a profound structural weakness. India currently imports roughly 85% of its crude oil.
85%.
85. And a massive 60% of that comes directly from the Gulf. Now, overlay that data with the ongoing crisis in West Asia. You have these critical maritime choke points, specifically the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait under severe daily threat.
And just to be clear, when you say choke points, you mean narrow, hyper-congested shipping lanes where a single sunken tanker or rebel group with anti-ship missiles can effectively block global trade.
Precisely. That is precisely the threat. Yeah. Now, combine that physical instability with the economic maneuvering of OPEC+.
Right, the oil cartel.
Yeah. For those tracking energy markets, OPEC Plus is heavily influenced by Saudi Arabia and Russia, and they actively collude to restrict oil production. They are intentionally keeping the supply tight.
So you have restricted supply, meeting high geopolitical risk.
Exactly. And the direct result is a massive surge in global oil prices.
But the briefing documents emphasize that this isn't just about citizens paying a few extra rupees at the gas pump, right? This triggers a cascading macroeconomic crisis. It basically escalates into a direct threat to national security.
It does.
So let's break down the actual mechanism of that crisis. How does expensive oil mathematically crash a nation's currency?
Well, think about the mechanics of the current account deficit, or the CAD. India buys its oil on the global market, which means it has to pay in U.S. dollars.
Okay.
So when oil prices spike, India's import bill inflates drastically. To pay that massive bill, the central bank has to dip into its foreign exchange reserves, literally selling off rupees to buy dollars.
Got it. So you are flooding the market with rupees while simultaneously draining your own dollar reserves.
Which fundamentally devalues the rupee based on just basic supply and demand. But the bleeding doesn't stop there.
How so?
When foreign investors see India's forex reserves dropping and the rupee losing value, their profit margins on Indian investments begin to evaporate. They get nervous.
Oh, so they pull out.
Right. They pull their capital out of the country, which requires selling even more rupees. This vicious cycle drastically widens the current account deficit. The direct, unavoidable mathematical result is a sharp, painful depreciation of the Indian currency.
I want to make sure you, the listener, really grasp the absolute absurdity of this vulnerability. It's the concept of imported inflation. I mean, it's like having your personal bank account legally tied to a stranger's road rage incident in a different hemisphere.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
Right. A single drone hits a commercial tanker in the Red Sea, and instantly, the profit margins of a manufacturer in Mumbai are wiped out. The rupee crashes because of an event New Delhi had absolutely zero control over.
The analogy captures the precise frustration of Indian policymakers. Modern national security is entirely inseparable from economic security, and the immediate strategic fixes on the board right now, they are strictly hard power moves.
Like what?
Rapidly expanding physical strategic petroleum reserves and accelerating the domestic green transition. You have to physically insulate the currency from Middle Eastern wars.
But if your economy is constantly held hostage by maritime choke points controlled by other nations, I mean, the only logical countermove is to build the capability to hold someone else's economy hostage. Which brings us to geography as hard power. The Great Nicobar Fortress.
This is a monumental shift in maritime posture. India is currently executing a $10 billion plus mega project to transform the Great Nicobar Island into a dual-use military and transshipment fortress.
$10 billion.
Plus, we're talking about deep-water naval bases, extended airstrips, capable of handling strategic bombers, radar stations, the works.
And the reason New Delhi is pouring billions into the specific island is purely about real estate. Great Nicobar is located a mere 40 nautical miles from the Malacca Strait,
Which is arguably the single most critical maritime choke point on Earth for Beijing. It is the vital artery for Chinese sea lines of communication, or SLOCs.
Right.
The vast majority of China's energy imports from the Middle East and Africa must flow through that narrow, congested stretch of water. By building a heavily armed military fortress just 40 miles away, India gains a terrifying amount of leverage over those SLOCs.
So in strategic terms, it is a dagger pointed directly at China's economic jugular.
That is exactly what it is.
Okay, I need to push back hard on this because the intelligence also outlines a brutal security versus sustainability dilemma here.
Yes, the ecological impact.
Right. This project requires the irreversible destruction of pristine, irreplaceable rainforests. We are talking about clear-cutting a globally recognized biosphere and displacing incredibly vulnerable indigenous tribal communities. Environmentalists and human rights advocates are sounding the alarm. Is this not just a reckless, arrogant gamble? Are we really destroying our own biosphere for a phantom war that might never even happen?
Look, the ecological cost is severe, and the ethical friction is entirely real. No one is denying that. However, when we look at the geopolitical board, New Delhi's analysts are operating on cold, analytical pragmatism.
Pragmatism at the cost of a biosphere?
You have to look at China's string-of-pearls strategy. Beijing has spent the last decade building a network of military and commercial facilities completely encircling India, from Gwadar in Pakistan to Hambantota in Sri Lanka. This is not a phantom war. It is an active, ongoing strategic strangulation. State survival is on the line.
But is Beijing actually going to risk an all-out World War III level conflict over a shipping lane? I mean, it feels like 19th century imperial paranoia to just pave over an ecosystem to flex naval muscle.
It is not a flex, though. It is an insurance policy against encirclement. When you are being actively surrounded by a hostile superpower with a vastly larger economy and navy, you just do not have the luxury of prioritizing local ecology over national existence.
So it's seen as a do-or-die situation.
Exactly. The leverage over the Malacca Strait is a non-negotiable hard power asset. Without that fortress, India is sitting on its hands while the People's Liberation Army Navy turns the Indian Ocean into a Chinese lake. The fortress is viewed as a necessary existential evil.
Wow. Okay, let's follow that causal chain. You just put a massive $10 billion target right on the edge of China's most vital shipping lane. You have essentially provoked a superpower.
Yes.
If you do not have a way to deter them from simply launching a preemptive strike and bombing that new fortress into glass, the entire project is useless. So how is India guaranteeing Beijing won't pull the trigger?
And that brings us to the nuclear shield and the recent Agni MIRV test. The Agni MIRV capability is an absolute game changer for regional deterrence.
Right. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targetable Re-Entry Vehicle.
Correct.
Let's break down the mechanics of what MIRV actually is, because I think the visual imagery is vital for you to understand why it changes the math of war. Imagine you are defending a city. the older generation of ballistic missiles. That's like an enemy firing a single massive sniper bullet at you.
Right, one warhead.
Yeah. If you possess a highly advanced radar and defense system, you might be able to calculate its trajectory and swat that one bullet out of the sky. But MIRV technology is entirely different. It's less like a sniper bullet and more like a mothership opening its payload doors mid-flight in the upper atmosphere, releasing 5 or 6 autonomous drones.
Or a shotgun blast.
Exactly, a shotgun blast. Each of those drones has its own navigation brain, and they all peel off to actively steer toward totally different target cities simultaneously.
And that mothership capability is specifically designed to solve a very new, very dangerous problem. China has recently been developing hyper-advanced missile defense systems, specifically the HQ-19.
Okay.
Beijing is attempting to build a mid-course interception shield, meaning they want the capability to shoot down standard single-warhead Indian missiles while they are still in space, before they even re-enter the atmosphere.
Wow. So if China's shield works, India's entire nuclear deterrent is suddenly obsolete.
Because an enemy with a perfect shield has no reason to fear retaliation.
Exactly the threat. So MIRV is the countermeasure.
It is mathematically designed to completely saturate and overwhelm those enemy radars and interceptors. A defense system might be able to track one incoming warhead. It simply does not have the processing power or the interceptor volume to track and destroy 6 independent warheads traveling at Mach speeds, accompanied by decoys, all heading to different targets.
This connects directly to India's core military doctrine, doesn't it? Because India is famous on the global stage for maintaining a strict no first use policy, or NFU.
The NFU policy is the absolute bedrock of Indian nuclear strategy. India publicly promises never to be the first to launch a nuclear weapon in a conflict. But logically, if you promise to take the first hit, your entire national survival hinges on second strike credibility.
Right, you have to guarantee that after taking a devastating surprise attack, you still have enough firepower left in the silo to launch an apocalyptic retaliation.
Exactly. If the enemy thinks they can wipe out your missiles on the ground or intercept whatever you manage to fire back, they might actually risk a first strike.
So the logic is airtight. MIRV ensures that even if only a tiny handful of Indian Agni missiles survive a Chinese preemptive strike, those surviving missiles can release enough independent warheads to completely bypass the HQ-19 shield and inflict unacceptable damage on major Chinese cities.
It makes a preemptive strike functionally suicidal for Beijing. In the weird paradox of nuclear strategy, having the capacity for unimaginable violence is what guarantees the peace.
It is terrifying, but the mechanics definitely make sense. But this raises a massive red flag in the intelligence briefing for me. Why is India accelerating this incredibly aggressive military buildup right now? I mean, why the sudden rush to militarize Great Nicobar and test MIRV missiles today?
Well, the documents point to a subtle but massive doctrinal shift happening in Washington, D.C. In 2026, the United States made a highly calculated strategic pivot. They quietly reversed a major 2018 decision by renaming the Indo-Pacific Command back to the U.S. Pacific Command, or USPACOM.
Wait, they just dropped Indo.
They intentionally surgically dropped the word Indo.
Okay, I have to challenge this U.S. abandonment theory. I know we say in geopolitics that names are doctrines, but this feels like an overreaction. Is Washington really washing its hands of the entire Indian Ocean just by changing a letterhead?
It's more than a letterhead.
But the Quad Alliance still exists. The U.S. and India still conduct joint military exercises. Dropping Indo doesn't mean the U.S. 7th Fleet just vanishes from the map, right?
In the Pentagon, doctrine dictates funding, and funding dictates asset deployment. It is much more than a letterhead. The U.S. might try to spin it in diplomatic cables as a simple historical correction, but the intelligence community in New Delhi reads the subtext loud and clear. Washington is executing a total, narrow pivot to a Taiwan-centric defense strategy.
You are saying the U.S. military is completely obsessed with a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan to the exclusion of all else.
The logistics of defending Taiwan against a full-scale amphibious assault require every available American asset. Their aircraft carriers, their logistics chains, their crisis planning is all moving east of the Malacca Strait. The unspoken mandate delivered to New Delhi is chilling.
The mandate is basically, you are on your own.
That is the message. India must shoulder the burden of policing the Indian Ocean entirely alone. The U.S. cavalry will not be riding to the rescue in a maritime conflict west of Malacca.
So this forces India into a corner where it must maintain fierce strategic autonomy.
It means India has no choice but to build a massive, hyper-capable blue water navy immediately, because the American security umbrella over the Indian Ocean is quietly closing.
Okay, let's synthesize the briefing so far because the picture is getting incredibly intense. India is now militarily isolated in the Indian Ocean, forced to stand alone against Chinese encirclement. At the exact same time as we detailed in segment 1, the nation is economically bleeding at the absolute mercy of West Asian oil and imported inflation. We have a vulnerable currency and a lonely military. What is the ultimate permanent fix? How does a nation actually rewrite its destiny under those conditions?
Well, the only permanent fix is to rewrite the rules of your own geography. You have to change the source of your power, and that brings the intelligence briefing to thorium and the quest for absolute energy independence.
Because India has this massive, crippling paradox. You have an exploding economy with insane, skyrocketing energy demands, but incredibly poor domestic uranium reserves. The country is basically held hostage by international and nuclear fuel cartels and Middle Eastern oil sheikhs.
It is a severe geological disadvantage. But here is the miracle hidden in the periodic table. While India lacks uranium, it possesses a staggering 25% of the entire world's thorium reserves.
25%.
Yes. It is just sitting there, logged in the monazite sands along the coast of Kerala.
It sounds like a geopolitical cheat code, but the briefing notes a massive physics catch here. You can't just shovel thorium into a reactor.
No, you can't. Thorium is not naturally fissile. If you dig it up and throw it in a reactor, it will not sustain a nuclear chain reaction. It cannot generate power on its own. It has to be transmuted.
Wait, how do you transmute a metal? Are we talking about modern-day atomic alchemy?
It is essentially exactly that, and it relies on the genius of Homi Bhabha's visionary three-stage nuclear program designed decades ago. In stage 1 and stage 2, you use your limited domestic uranium and plutonium to create a very specific type of nuclear reaction. You place the thorium-232 inside the reactor as a blanket.
Okay, so a blanket of thorium.
Right, and the nuclear reaction bombards the thorium with stray neutrons, fundamentally changing its atomic structure. It breeds the thorium into a completely new man-made isotope, uranium-233. And U-233 is highly fissile.
So connecting this all the way back to the rupee crisis and the Red Sea drone strikes from our first segment, mastering these highly complex Stage 3 thorium reactors by the 2047 vision, this isn't just a science project to keep the lights on in Delhi.
No. It is the holy grail of hard power. It is the ultimate strategic force multiplier.
It is the only way to permanently insulate the Indian macroeconomic system from Middle Eastern wars. I mean, if you can power your entire national grid, your manufacturing base, and your military with domestic thorium, a drone strike on an oil tanker in the Red Sea no longer spikes your import bill. Your central bank doesn't have to drain its forex reserves. The rupee doesn't crash. You take a geographical weakness and transmute it into centuries of total economic insulation.
It permanently cuts the strings attached to the global oil market. It allows the military to project power without worrying about fuel embargoes. It changes the entire calculus of the region.
We have covered an immense amount of high-level intelligence today, moving from macroeconomics to nuclear physics. Before we close this briefing, we need to lock these concepts in. We are going to do a rapid-fire rundown of the core memory anchors for you. Do not let these slip.
Let's do it.
First, imported inflation. This is the macroeconomic bleeding. When a distant geopolitical crisis spikes global oil prices, it forces India to drain its dollar reserves, instantly crashing the rupee.
Second, MIRV, Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle, the mothership missile technology that saturates Chinese radar defenses, absolutely guaranteeing India's second strike nuclear capability.
Third, Malacca Strait, the vital, hyper-congested maritime choke point just 40 miles from the Great Nicobar Project. This is India's ultimate geographic leverage over China's energy supply lines.
Fourth, security versus sustainability dilemma. The brutal, real-world calculation forcing New Delhi to sacrifice pristine rainforests and indigenous lands to build a $10 billion military fortress essential for state survival against encirclement.
Fifth, USPACOM, the Pentagon dropping Indo from its Pacific Command doctrine. It is the unmistakable signal that Washington's military assets are pivoting strictly to Taiwan, leaving India entirely on its own to police the Indian Ocean.
And sixth, uranium-233, or the thorium cycle. The holy grail of energy security, the process of using atomic alchemy on Kerala's monazite sands to buy centuries of true independence, permanently insulating the rupee from the Middle East.
Those are the anchors. Let them dictate how you read the news tomorrow.
I want to leave you with one final chilling geopolitical thought to ponder as we close this briefing. Throughout this entire analysis, we've looked at India scrambling to secure its borders, scrambling to shield its currency, and scrambling to defend its oceans from superpowers. But project this intelligence forward to the year 2047. If India successfully achieves total thorium energy independence, while simultaneously controlling the Malacca choke point from an island fortress, its entire national psychology shifts. It fundamentally transitions from being a defensive power reacting to global shocks to an offensive power capable of dictating global trade. Here's the question you need to ask yourself tonight. Are the current global superpowers truly prepared for an India that no longer just survives the world order, but has the hard power to actively shape it?